Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Business of Design presented by UX Woman. My name is Sumaya, and I'm a founder at UX Woman. I have over 9 years of expertise across startups, consulting, and corporate, most recently specializing in inclusive designs for brands like Disney, Hulu, and Marvel. And I'm going to cover a couple of topics in this mini session today. So we're going to talk about how business and design intersect, the business of design in startups versus consulting and corporate. We're going to talk about entrepreneurship and design and how they intersect as well. And we're also going to talk about blue ocean strategy and product positioning and the design process and building a business model, and how these are interconnected. And then finally, we're going to talk about the future of business and design. So let's get right into it, how business and design intersect. So one of my favorite representations of the design process is the double diamond. And in the double diamond, we spend the first half of the design process, which is designing the right thing. And we do a lot of research and context gathering. So in this case, we're doing a lot of secondary research. So we might be doing competitor analyses, market analyses. We might try to hone our project topic or our startup topic idea or our corporate feature idea. And then we start to do primary research in the form of interviews. So that could include discovery interviews. It could include, ideation workshops, and really getting to know the community and the stakeholders that we're designing for. And then what we start to do is we start to distill a lot of our insights into themes and opportunity spaces, and we start to slowly and gradually converge on one idea or one feature to build. And that's where we are at, the point between the two diamonds. And that's when we get more into the design side of things. So at this stage, we're doing more ideation and we're thinking about designing things right, which means we've narrowed down all our concepts to one concept or one feature. But now, how do we visualize that one concept, right? There could be multiple ways to visualize it. So again, we do some diverging. We come up with different visualizations of that idea, and then we test and iterate until we finally have the most optimized version of the product or solution that we can build within a certain timeline. And that's kind of how it is. And we go from A to B, and it's a cyclical process, right? So once we have created that optimized feature or product, the process goes on, right? We go into another cycle of research and context gathering and improvements from the design side of things. And so it's something to kind of refresh on so that you can see how things relate to the business side of things. But in reality, it's not as neat and clean as a double diamond process, right? The reality of a design process when we work at startups or consulting or corporate is that there's going to be a lot of uncertainty and patterns that you're sifting through at the beginning of the design process. And you're gradually narrowing down on all that uncertainty via qualitative and quantitative methods. And you're gradually getting to something that has more clarity and more focus. And that's when you get to the concept phase of things. So this is my favorite representation of UX research and UX design. I think this is the truthful version of what the design process feels like when you're a researcher or designer on a startup team, consulting team, corporate team, you name it. And so how does business come into all of this, and how, what role does business play in the design process? So a lot of career changers and beginners at UX have this misconception that UX and user experience is all about the user. And the only thing we need to care about is what the user needs and wants, and then design around the user. And yes, this is true, but that is only 1/3 of what the ideal design process looks like. So desirability or the user perspective and the user needs are just 1/3 of the design process. We also need to think about viability and feasibility. And when we think about viability, we're mostly thinking about stakeholder perspectives at the company, and we're thinking about revenues and return on investment and budgets for whether we can create something within a timeline and within a budget that's been set to us by certain stakeholders. And when we think about feasibility, we think, can we build this? Can we build this in X amount of time with X amount of money? So really, the best designs and the most valuable, impactful designs lie at the center of desirability, viability, and feasibility. And when we say desirability, what do we mean? We mean, does it fill a need? Will it fit into people's lives? Can we make them want it? When we think about viability, we're thinking about, does it align with business goals? What's the return on investment? Can this be done within a budget? When we think about feasibility, we like to think about tech and operations constraints. How long will it take to build? Do we have the resources available or the skills and expertise available to build it? And I'm not going to say that the design process is this perfect thing, right? The truth is that the design process and the way it has been defined is simply a tool for designers to sell design at a company. So when you get to the principal level, the director level, the VP level of design, when you become the chief design officer at a company, your whole job is to sell and market design and the value of design to other stakeholders and educate them on why design is so important. And so that's what the design process is. When we talk about the design process, we're talking about a way to sell and educate stakeholders on a creative way of approaching more logical business-minded problems. But there's still problems in the design process today, and we need to kind of keep troubleshooting and keep improving our processes as we go. So a lot of times with the traditional design process, we don't often consider business impact metrics to the extent that stakeholders and executives want or need. So sometimes, like I had said, we're dealing with a lot of incomplete data. We're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, like you saw in that squiggly line. And we have to, in this case, start to manage stakeholders on that uncertainty and that fear that they have around the uncertainty within the project. Because, not all data is made equal. Sometimes we might not have access to that data. We don't fully understand operational costs and constraints when scoping design ideas and why ideas are shot down. A lot of times, especially at large corporates, there's so many silos, right? So we as designers on the design team don't fully understand the perspectives of our other stakeholder teams or the constraints and pressures that they're under. And we need to really fully understand the business model, or we might not even have access to certain metrics that, folks have at the executive level. And so we might feel like we're flying a bit blindly. And so if we don't fully understand the business model of the business or company that we're working for, it can be easy to, scope ideas or propose elements in creativity that get shot down because we simply didn't have the full picture. And then another element with the design process that I've seen and that has been problematic in everyday work is that we don't fully understand how to gather impactful metrics data that can wow investors and business executives. And a lot of times this starts because, other teams and business leaders need project deliverables urgently. And so there's not enough time put into setting up a project for success and really evaluating what's the baseline that we're approaching this from, right? What are the baseline metrics that we have available to us today? And can we measure those baseline metrics at the end of this project to see if we've had an impact? So more seasoned researchers really advocate for setting these baselines over time and setting new baselines over time. But that takes time, right? So sometimes you might have to run with a project where you don't have those baseline metrics, and gradually over time you propose more infrastructure so that you have those metrics to back you up for future projects. And so what is the solution for incorporating business strategy into our design process and really making sure that we remove these gaps and obstacles and frustrations that come up as we practice the design process within startups and consultings and corporates? So one element we need to start to think about as designers is less silos and more transparency between teams, right? This will help us understand the operational constraints that other teams are under, the pressures that other teams are under. And so the more we can make that accessible, the more we can make our research and design accessible, the more we can teach other teams about design, there's going to be more transparency and trust between the teams and less silos, because they will feel empowered to share information with us and our teams as well. We also need more leeway to run short design experiments, so prototypes, to gather impactful quantitative data. And this is much easier in startups, because startups tend to have smaller teams and can easily run quick experiments that tend to be riskier for large corporates and consulting companies. And so that's why you'll always notice that, some of the more innovative corporate companies that don't have that still are able to value innovation will actually create startup innovation teams and create like a think tank or a startup hub where those startup teams can move faster and be a little bit detached from the main corporate world, but they might be funded by the Googles and the Apples of the world or the Amazons of the world. So really, it's because they're building new products, it's much easier to pivot, it's much easier to change things. You don't have as big of a user base. Once you turn into a big corporate, there's much more risk, right? You might be an international business or a national business. There might be a lot of regulatory concerns that come up if you even have to make the smallest change. And so it becomes harder to run these quick prototypes to gather quantitative data. And so, companies need to find a way, whether it's an innovation hub or whether it's an innovation team, to still act fast, even if the whole company might not be able to move at the speed that that innovation team is moving. And we also want to, see how a company values change as a norm and isn't stuck in one way of doing things. So I think if we look at some of the best design companies on earth, Apple, right, comes to mind first and foremost, Netflix. They are constantly changing. They're constantly evolving. They don't stick to a status quo. They don't have one set way of doing things. Instead, everything is up for change. Everything could be improved, and they're constantly working from that mindset. And you can see that in the products they design and build. We also talk about Blue Ocean strategy in our curriculum in our 7-month UX design MBA program, where we talk about signs of a toxic work environment where innovation gets crushed. And usually once innovation starts getting crushed, the company starts to decline over a period of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, you name it. But they start to go down, and other better more innovative companies and competitors start to come up. So one really great example was BlackBerry, right? BlackBerry was the first to put the internet on a cell phone. And, we had a lot of business corporate folks checking their email on their BlackBerries when that first came out. But who uses a BlackBerry today, right? Nobody. And it's because BlackBerry was very stuck to the status quo. The CEO was adamant that, this is all we need. We don't need to make any more improvements to our product. This is the baseline, and we just need to, keep selling and keep marketing. Meanwhile, Apple came out with a redesigned screen and interface that we still use today. I set mine on black and white so that I don't get distracted. They also came up with having multiple applications on the phone to distract us and to keep us engaged with our phones. So that is, one example of how a company that values change as a norm isn't stuck in one way of doing things. And just because BlackBerry did it didn't mean Apple had to do it, right? So Apple had that innovative change mindset, and they were good with change management, versus BlackBerry kind of stuck to the status quo, stuck to the baseline that they had created and never improved from that baseline. And we also want to think about a company that runs operation in a way where change becomes easier to implement. So change management is crucial. It's what service designers do. It's what consultants do when they go into large corporate companies and help improve and set up processes. But basically, design is infused into every single element of a really good innovative company like Apple and Netflix. And so it's not just the designers who design, but there's folks in operations and other teams who are constantly rethinking the process and redesigning the process so that change becomes easier to implement. And so we also want to now kind of get flavors of what design and business looks like and how they, work together in startups versus consulting versus corporate as well. In startups, the focus really lies on creating and iterating on an MVP or minimum viable product. And this MVP becomes sellable. And at which point this company starts to grow and gain traction and starts to actually sell and become a real business. But until the company or startup starts selling, they are just at the MVP phase, and they're constantly pivoting, they're constantly rethinking their MVP, and they're constantly making drastic, big changes to their MVP until it starts to sell. And we call this product market fit when it gets to a point where they're selling and marketing as much as they're taking time to design and build. It means that there's going to be a shift towards sales activities at the company. And that means there's going to be less time for tinkering on the designs to the extent or making such drastic changes as they did at the beginning when they had no customer base. So that's when a startup really starts to grow and scale and eventually mature into a corporate company. The focus in consulting relies on selling design services. So we have to understand service design, which we have another video on, and how it can help both long-term and short-term business strategies for a client company are really crucial in that stage. And so service design is about, yes, designing products and services, but it's also about optimizing operations and optimizing the business model at a company. Whereas, especially with a lot of large corporates, they might have gotten used to the status quo, right? Over years, they might have gotten used to a set way of doing things, and it becomes comfortable and it becomes easy and it becomes convenient. And a lot of times consultants are brought in to shake things up and to change things around. So some of the best consultants are the ones who really know how to push back on their client in a really thoughtful manner and really influence change within the company. So it's not always about listening to the client, which is something that a lot of junior designers and career changers think that's what consulting is you get the brief, you don't question it, and you go for it. But if you are one of the best consulting firms, you are co-creating a brief together. You're pushing back on your client to provide them with possibilities that they might not have thought of. And then finally, in corporate, the focus lies on continuing to grow and scale the business with minimal tweaks and adjustments to the products and services offered, since the business is already established. So at corporations, it's really more about scale and optimizing on that scale. So, a lot of times corporates might focus on smaller tweaks and adjustments they might need to make to a product based on where they're selling the product or service. Are they selling in Europe or Asia Pacific or South America or North America? So the product or service offering changes, the localization changes depending on where they're offering their product or service. And then in terms of operations, they might also be thinking about franchises or cities and locations at cities and how they're scaling within each city or locale. So there's, different considerations there where it's not so much the focus on drastically changing and rebranding products and services, but really optimizing for scale. So how does entrepreneurship and design intersect in the first place? Entrepreneurship seeks to create a unique, differentiated products or services to achieve groundbreaking innovation and new ways of doing things. So when in our 7-month UX Design MBA program, we touch on case studies on Airbnb, Tesla, even Tinder, Uber, and so much more within our course to really understand how a big brand comes about and how it kind of changes the status quo, right? Especially Airbnb, Tinder, and Uber really changed the way we do things and really reinvented the way we think about our world and think about society. Before these companies existed, we would never have gotten into a car with a stranger. We would never have thought it was possible to sleep at a stranger's house. We would never have, just started chatting strangers on an app randomly and then go on dates with them. But somehow, all these 3 brands made us feel safe enough and secure enough and to do this and to make a really drastic change in our lives. So how did that happen? I really, in our 7-month UX Design MBA program, love to focus on our students building differentiated products and services and really thinking things from a fresh and innovative perspective, because that's what's going to help them stand out as UX candidates, right? They don't want to be building another not so innovative cookie cutter rebrand or refresh or redesign of an existing product. That's not exciting. That's not interesting. But to really capture a hiring manager or recruiter's attention and show them how innovative or strategic or creative you can be as a designer or researcher, I think, this is just my opinion, that you need to focus on innovation and you need to come up with really new innovative approaches that challenge the status quo of what's happening today. And so let's kind of start to look at some of the growth phases of a startup. So as I had mentioned, when a startup first comes together, they are in something called problem solution fit mode. So the founders are doing a lot of discovery interviews. They might do as many as 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 discovery interviews to really understand the market that they are exploring, to understand the key problems and the most urgent problems within those communities. And they might be talking to multiple communities, right? They might have a hypothesis or idea that could apply to multiple communities, and they want to see who or what community is going to be the early adopter. What community has the most urgent problem that needs fixing right away? And the reason startup founders and designers and researchers at startup companies focus on urgent problems is because if the problem isn't urgent, nobody's going to buy, right? So if you settle on a problem that's not so urgent, people don't feel that urgency to buy yesterday, to buy today, to buy right now, to buy within this week or this month. And they might, choose to wait for 6 months or a year, which means that that problem isn't really as urgent as we thought. So problem solution fit is really important, and it's really a big part of pinpointing what's the right problem to solve in the first place before we, startup founders go and come up with multiple concepts and come up with multiple ways of solving that problem and pressure test those concepts until they hit on something. So essentially at the startup MVP phase, you're literally stuck in the first half of that double diamond, right? Your MVP is so basic because you are already thinking about multiple concepts and you want to be able to pivot from one concept to another really fast. And you don't want to invest all your eggs in one basket because that concept might not work. So it's almost like throwing darts at multiple concepts until you hit on a dart where it starts to get monetized. And that's when we get into product market fit. And so here you see, before we get into product market fit, we're also searching for language market fit, which means how are we positioning our product? How are we articulating the benefits and the offer that we have to present to our market so that the market is really excited and feels that they need to, pursue this product or service urgently. And so, a lot of times when we're pressure testing concepts, it might not be the concept itself that's a failure, but it might be the way that we articulated the concept that is a failure. So startups also do a lot of product positioning, and they might take that one concept and find 5 or 10 different ways to position that product and articulate that offering. And then that's what leads to a hit, right? Someone decides to buy. And that's when we get into product market fit. And in product market fit, basically what's happening is that the company is now selling as much as it and spending as much time selling and marketing as it is to just run the business and run operations. So they're so pulled into sales and marketing efforts, and all their operations at the company are so pulled into serving customers that they have less time to redesign things and make such drastic changes to their product. And instead they're focusing on selling and growing at this stage. And so, yes, they will make incremental improvements to the product, but it'll be based on sales and marketing and customer feedback. And then that's when we start to see channel product fit. So they might have hit on one channel to sell to and one way of connecting and distributing their product or service. to prospective customers and customers. But what they will find over time is that there's multiple ways to approach a customer, right? You could approach a customer on Instagram, you could approach a customer on LinkedIn, you could approach a customer in real life at a store or franchise, or distribute your product at a grocery store. So there's a whole bunch of different ways to approach a customer, and startups start to evaluate these different channels of distribution, whether they be digital or physical channels. And then they start to pinpoint, okay, what are the top 2 to 3 channels for me? And they keep trying to grow and scale that. And then as they grow and scale those channels, they move on to new channels and try and grow and scale that. And that's how, you see these startups like Airbnb and Uber grow from a really small startup into a large, really established global businesses, right? So when Airbnb first started, they first started just in New York City and San Francisco. And then they eventually scaled to more cities in the US and then scaled globally. Same thing with Uber, right? They started at, I believe, a small community near UC Berkeley. And they just served that one community within the city. And then they scaled things to the rest of the city. And then they scaled to more cities until it was global. And that's when we're getting to maturity, right? So at this point, you have scaled and grown your business. You might be considered a multi-million-dollar company or corporate, and you are thinking of optimizing things based on regulation, based on language, right? Uber in Greece is going to look very different from Uber in Spain. In fact, there is no Uber in Barcelona because, they made their own version, which is great for them. So we're starting to think about, how companies are growing and scaling and tackling the regulatory needs and concerns of other countries, the localization needs and concerns, the language and cultural fit, right? When Netflix was scaling to, other countries, they had to really be mindful and really thoughtful about cultural elements when creating stories. And that was really important. We talk about Netflix in the 7-month design MBA as well. So to kind of recap, problem solution fit in the business world translates to discovery interviews in the design world. So in the 7-month UX Design MBA program, we treat you like a startup founder, and you get to go through the end-to-end double diamond process, but you're also learning a lot of really advanced skill sets that are, things like product positioning, product and feature scoping, building a business model for your MVP, and showing how that business model will scale over time as the MVP scales. And they might scale hand in hand, right? Maybe it's the business that scales first and then the product, or maybe there's an element of the product that draws people in and then the business is able to scale. So really kind of thoroughly understanding the MVP and the business model. And discovery interviews really lead to uncovering the most urgent problem that our target users have. They help us pinpoint exactly who our target users should be. And when we talk about discovery interviews, we are talking about very open-ended what and why questions, right? We're talking about really getting the user to open up to us. It's almost like a date where we want to really get not only the answer to the question that we asked, but we also want to get side stories and side context on what the user's world looks like, because any context and every context is really relevant and could give us clues that, maybe our competitors don't have. Discovery interviews are the crux of innovation, right? We really understand the emotional world of our users, what they value, what their purpose is. And quite frankly, a lot of times startups succeed and grow to the scale that they do because their competitors just don't have the bandwidth or value innovation to the extent that startups do, which is why startups tend to be the most innovative places to work, and they're a lot of fun to work in. Startups are my chosen world. I've always had way more fun working in a startup than corporate. Don't tell corporate. So the next stage is building an MVP in the startup world, basically translates to building digital prototypes and testing them in the design world. So we might be building very multiple mid-fidelity, even low-fidelity concepts that our startup founders might be testing. And we might just even be putting out a lot of product positioning out there. We might just, create one or two screens just to kind of put an idea out there and see if people latch on to that idea or want to learn more about that idea. So we talk a lot more about a more quantitative approach to prototyping. So in the corporate world, we're very much in Figma land when it comes to prototyping. And then basically the prototype is just developed and shipped and tested by research. But in startups, it's a little bit different. We don't have the certainty that corporates do that this product is going to work in the market or is going to be sold in the market. And so we have very different quantitative based prototyping approaches before we even get into Figma, quite frankly. And so that's something that is really important to learn and understand as well. And so digital prototypes and prototype experiments can evaluate MVP ideas for feasibility and viability. The reason I love to talk about Tinder because Tinder is probably the most perfect example of what an MVP looks like. And you can see how Tinder continued to maintain simplicity even as they scaled into a billion-dollar business. But their app still really remains very, very simple. And that simplicity is what got them to go viral back when they first started. So we talk about Tinder as a case study in the 7-month UX Design MBA program. And we talk about the two elements that Tinder used when kind of distributing this prototype out into the market and how they got that virality. And it was not just because of a prototype, it was also because of prototyping experiments as well. So we're now thinking about achieving product market fit in the startup world, and this really translates to setting up a functional and operational business model and then scaling that business to maturity. So this is also what we cover in the 7-month UX Design MBA. Not only do you need to focus on one MVP solution and justify with qualitative and quantitative data why you're focusing on that one concept over the 10 or 20 other concepts you might have come up with and explored. But now you have to come up with a business model for that MVP. And this kind of goes hand in hand, right? It's not like we build the product first and then build the business model, or we build the business model first and then we build the product. It kind of happens in synchronicity, right? As you're doing all those discovery interviews, you're gathering insights. And if you're a creative or a founder, you really have this very associative mindset. We're not talking about logical thinking here. Entrepreneurship is actually often not about logic. It's all about emotion and reading the emotions of your user base. And also coming up with those associative patterns, right? Noticing things and connecting the dots in the way that maybe mainstream society would not. So let's talk about the design process and building a business model. So what is a business model? It is the process of mapping out operational process and cost and pricing structures needed to provide a product or service. We often visualize this as a business model canvas, and you can go online and you can find a template for the business model canvas. I'm about to show it to you. And it's a way of just very quickly brainstorming a business model for your ideas if you're thinking of starting a company or business. And yes, we like to visualize the business model with a business model canvas. And the business model canvas is revised and reiterated on just like how we iterate on products and services within the design process. So it's a living and breathing process. Just because we put it on the business model canvas doesn't mean it's set in stone. We might come back to it every month, every 2 months, every 3 months, every 6 months. And we might find better ways of doing things, more efficient ways of doing things. And we go back to the chopping board and we rethink it, we restructure it, we recreate it. And that does not always mean reinventing the wheel. I'm not talking about drastic changes. It might also mean small incremental improvements as well. So let's look at this business model canvas. And I wanted to kind of break it down to you because mostly a successful business is not built in one day, right? It takes time. It might take anywhere between 6 months to a year to build a business that can monetize. So what we like to do is we like to start with value propositions and customer segments. We really like to understand what our customer segments want through discovery interviews. And then we try to come up with differentiators or ideas that might really entice our customer segments to buy our product or service urgently, right? We're trying to solve their most urgent problem. So when we first start out, the founders are doing a lot of discovery interviews, and they're really trying to nail down their customer segments and what are the most uh, I I guess what's the word for it? The most active customer segments, or the ones who are most likely to hop on the product fast, like an early adopter. Because not all customer segments are made equal, right? Some customer segments might be more urgently in need of a solution than others. And then they come up with the value propositions based on those interviews and context gathering. And that's where that's what we call problem solution fit. Once we start to get into the MVP phase, we're starting to come up with different concepts that we're testing, and we're prototyping and prototyping. And then we're positioning all these different concepts, and we're gathering quantitative data on whether these ideas are working or not. And some of the quantitative data we gather from a startup prototyping perspective could be things like lead generation, right? Are we gathering emails and phone numbers from prospective customers? It could be amount of time spent on sales demos or calls to learn more about the product or service. And finally, the ultimate proof that a product or MVP could, turn into a real business is sales, right? Is there a pre-order put down for this idea? Or are we starting to get sales for one of our MVP ideas or our most basic ideas? Because once we see sales, then we know we can invest more time and effort into improving that product or service. So this is where, we're starting to think of revenue streams and the cost structure. How much money did it take or resources did it take to build our MVP ideas? And how much do we need to charge to kind of keep that cycle going? And so that's where you're getting into, really focusing on one or two MVPs, or maybe just one MVP at this stage because you've done your vetting and quantitative data gathering. And now we're getting into product market fit. So at this point, you're hitting that chasm that you cross over as a startup into a real business. And all of a sudden you're making sales. Most of your time goes into sales. And so you might want to start thinking about customer relationships and how you continue to build customer relationships, and what channels of distribution are you using to build those relationships. So you're really expanding on your marketing and sales capabilities because you see that, you've hit on something, you've hit on a product idea that people want, that people are buying. So how do you grow this? How do you grow this even more now that you've hit on something? And so that's where we're now starting to look at maturity, and we're starting to optimize key activities, key resources, and key partners as we grow and scale our business. So maybe over time, maybe we start, obviously as a startup, we start by doing everything ourselves. But maybe over time, we find some key partners who will help us with channel building. Maybe we might find an SEO expert who helps us build SEO. Maybe we find a social media expert who helps us build a YouTube presence, right? Maybe in terms of key activities, we expand to more activities as our team grows and scales over time. And then we start to distribute our key resources. We try to wonder, what key resources do we need to keep internally? Like, this is our differentiator. This is something unique to us. We don't want it getting out elsewhere. So those are the things we do internally as a company versus what do we delegate and let a consulting company deal with externally. And what you might find is actually some of the most innovative companies don't use consultants, right? It's crazy. As a consultant myself, as I've worked in all startups, consulting, corporate, everything, you name it, as a consultant, I ended up working for NBC Universal to design their Peacock streaming and their Peacock TV. And they brought in consultants because even though they had internal teams dedicated to building those products and services, they still needed consultant help. I don't see Netflix doing that. So when I go on, and I stalk Netflix like crazy because I'm a big nerd about all things Netflix. Netflix, please hire me. But when I look at Netflix, Netflix does not seem to hire consultants, or not that I've seen or known of, maybe correct me if I'm wrong. And instead, Netflix chooses to do everything in-house. So Netflix has even created a team, a service design team within the company to optimize on production processes at the company. So film production processes and film technology. And I think that's really exciting. And I nerd out on it when I look at their career page. So just something that I noticed because I'm a nerd. And finally, I wanted to also talk about Blue Ocean strategy and product positioning. So Blue Ocean strategy is about providing a product or service at a low cost, but has high value to an invisible market or community. And this is something that we talk about and go into 3 Blue Ocean strategy case studies when within our 7-month UX design MBA. So one example is Rihanna and Fenty Beauty, right? When we think about invisible markets, we need to think about communities that the mainstream does not see. And so if we were to compete in a very saturated market like beauty, we're more likely to fail as a startup because there's already too much competition and larger companies with more resources than us. So if you were to start a beauty brand or an e-commerce beauty brand, you're just more likely to fail as a startup unless you hit on a niche community. And that's what Rihanna did when she created Fenty Beauty. So what Rihanna found was that women with really light skin tones and women with really dark skin tones had a really hard time finding their color match in terms of a foundation for makeup. And this was an urgent problem for these women, right? Because when us ladies, when we like to, go out into the world, we like to look presentable. And the first thing we do, even if we're running late, is we're going to put some touch up and some foundation and moisturizer and then walk out the door. If we have time, we might, do the lipstick and the mascara and the eyeliner and the whole 9 yards. But if we're running late, our bare minimum, most urgent requirement is to look presentable and clean and to cover up maybe our dark circles or a blemish or a dark spot, whatever it is. And so Rihanna was really strategic that her flagship product was a foundation product. And she noticed that, mainstream businesses were only providing 20 to 30 different shades of foundation for the markets. And what she did was she decided to create 40 and then 50 different shades. So she nearly doubled the amount of shades provided. And because of she had to double the number of shades provided, she also had to manufacture more. So within the first year of starting the business, I believe, she was already shipping her product to other countries, right? Because other countries have different skin tones and the darker shades were selling in other countries. And so Fenty is, I believe, currently valued at 2.8 billion. But that was through finding an invisible market or a niche market that, the mainstream hadn't caught up on. And then guess what? She was so successful that she shifted the whole market towards her trends. So companies, all the big beauty brands like L'Oreal, Revlon, whatever their names are, CoverGirl, that were initially providing only 20 to 30 shades, started to now work their way towards creating at least 40 and maybe even 50 shades of foundation. So she really shifted where the industry was going in terms of innovation. And we also need to think about product positioning. So how do we find, blue oceans through discovery interviews? And so let's talk about the business of the future of business and design. So innovation is always going to be fueled by processes that combine design, business strategy, and tech and operations constraints into fluid systems that can be changed and adapted over time to evolve into something better. So change management is a huge deal for innovation. So there's less of a focus on hot tech like AI or VR and more of a focus on ethical and inclusive design and business strategy. Yes, I cannot deny that AI is everywhere, but we are also seeing a lot of terrible AI products that add no value to our lives at the same time, right? And that's part of innovation. In the startup world too, not every startup makes it to success, right? You might get 100 startups and then 98% of them are going to fail within the first year of starting. And that number just keeps, growing over time. So It's only the select few startups that really win, like the Airbnbs and the Ubers of the world, that go on to really change and innovate everything the way that we do things, right? And we just need to keep that in mind. So just because you're seeing a lot of hot tech like AI and VR startups popping up, just know that 98% of them might also be failing sometime soon. And that's why in our program, we focus so heavily on quantitative prototyping methods, because the only way to make sure that you're not part of that 98% of failed startups is to really be thorough with your evaluation of your ideas and quantitatively vet your ideas. But you have to do that fast, and you have to do that with real impact-driven business metrics. So that's something, to think about. And so I'm going to pause there and end there. I hope you enjoyed this session on the business of design, and you can see how business influences the startup world, the corporate world, and the consulting world. And we touch on all of this within our 7-month UX Design MBA program. So please, click the link below if you want to learn more about the program. And I hope to see you in more lessons like this one.